Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to start, if I could, by asking unanimous consent to put something in the record that has to do with reporting. This is some of the feedback that we have received from industry and government with regard to our cyber notification legislation. I think the bill is better for this input, and I think it would be appropriate to have these letters included in the hearing record. All three relate to the legislation. One is from 18 trade associations, one is from the financial sector, one is from the communications sector, and the fourth is from the oil and gas sector, expressing their concerns in that case about lack of consultation with the pipeline industry before issuing security directives. I would ask unanimous consent these be placed in the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Let me start with something urgent. I'm really eager to get to the accountability issue because, as you know, I think that's critical for us to be able to organize ourselves properly going forward. But unfortunately, you know, we live in a state of constant attacks, and we just had another one. And there's a joint publication by CISA, the FBI, and the Coast Guard last week that indicates an advanced persistent threat, meaning right now, timely, a threat targeting a software program used to authenticate users when they log onto their computers. And according to this publication, it's widely used by several critical infrastructure sectors, and the hackers have covered their tracks, much like we saw with SolarWinds. So, again, I'd hope we could talk about the important, not just the urgent, but the urgent is upon us again. I would ask you, Ms. Easterly, can you briefly explain, you know, what this is and why it matters?
Yeah, thanks very much for asking that question, Ranking Member Portman, because it does speak to, I think, a really good news story and the collaboration and how we use data to help protect other sectors of critical infrastructure. So you're referring to something called ManageEngine AD Self-Service Plus, which is this password management and single sign-on capability. We worked with the U.S. Coast Guard on a vulnerability at the Port of Houston and found out about this. We work with our FBI partners and our Coast Guard partners to better understand that vulnerability and then to be able to get that information out to see whether, in fact, we saw the same vulnerability across the federal cyber ecosystem and in our critical infrastructure partners. This was actually one of the early successes for JCDC because we were able to share that information across our JCDC partners to see if they could find additional victims to notify. To this point in time, we see that the campaign thus far is limited, but we're continuing to work through it, and I'm happy to keep you apprised.
Well, I appreciate that. I guess I'm glad to hear that you feel like in this case we have a handle on it. I did speak to one of your prominent JCDC members yesterday, and I support what you're doing there, and including bringing the private sector expertise in, and I think it's critically important. The alert indicates that this advanced persistent threat and these actors have been exploiting vulnerabilities, but also covering their tracks. What does that mean? And does that mean if it's a nation-state actor, as an example, we're not going to be able to determine who it is?
Well, as you know, Ranking Member Portman, attribution can always be complicated in terms of being able to dispositively say who that threat actor is. Certainly the most sophisticated threat actors go to great lengths, as we saw with SolarWinds, to be able to cover their tracks and obfuscate their presence so that they can live for long times in networks and be able to extract data. But we are working very closely with our interagency partners and the intelligence community to better understand this threat actor so that we can ensure that we are not only able to protect systems, but ultimately to be able to hold these actors accountable for what they do. And
in terms of this one, can you tell us who you think it is?
At this point in time, I would have to get back with my colleagues, but I do think it is a nation-state actor, sir.
Concerning, yeah.
Yes, sir.
Okay, well, we look forward to hearing more as you have it, perhaps even in a classified setting to understand what we can do to be able to respond, as you say, to be able to push back against these nation-state actors who continue to probe and to commit these crimes against our public and private sector entities, in this case, critical infrastructure. Okay, accountability. I'm going to show a chart here that it is a chart that tries to explain what the roles are, and maybe it's just me, but it seems like there's a lot of overlapping responsibility, including, by the way, among the three of you. And the question is, you know, who's in charge, who's accountable? We talked about this latest hack, and you mentioned that you're involved as the, you know, CISA lead, which is good, but also you indicated that there are other entities involved, and the question is, you know, who's in charge and who will take accountability as things happen. So this chart has, with regard to the strategic side, a National Cyber Director who's here with us today. It has the Deputy National Security Advisor who's been with us here before. She is not with us today, but she has a role that she has indicated is in some ways quite similar to your role. Then we have OMB, of course, the federal CIO and the federal CISO role. And then the CISA Director and the FBI Assistant Director for Cyber are more on the operational side. And then the strategic side, of course, every agency head has to be involved and should be. And then, of course, the agency CIOs and the CISOs and the agencies, and that goes to our FISMA issue we talked about earlier. So I guess what I would start with you, Mr. Inglis, and again, I'm glad you're where you are. I wish you had more staff to be able to do your job, which is another topic we'll discuss. Under your authorizing statute, you are the principal advisor to the President on cybersecurity and cybersecurity strategy. Is that correct?
That's correct, sir.
And does that mean that you are the single point of accountability for federal cybersecurity within the executive branch?
I think I am the single point of accountability for federal cybersecurity on owned or leased estates, to include the federal government and the critical infrastructure. When we determine that we need to use instruments of power outside of owned or leased estates, the military, diplomacy, financial instruments of power, the National Security Council is the natural place to essentially coordinate those instruments of power, and therefore they would interact to determine what that strategy should be to do the rest of what's required. But for purposes of preparation, synthesis of the big picture, defense of owned and leased estates, performance assessment, I am the accountable person.
So are you accountable, as an example, if the Department of Homeland Security does not have proper cyber hygiene in place? Probably not a good example because they were one of the few agencies that we found of the 8 that was doing some of the right things, but let's say the Department of Health and Human Services or the Department of Energy. Are you the one responsible?
Yes, sir. I am ultimately the accountable person. Now, my job is to ensure that that accountability has been allocated properly to agency and department heads, to CISA for being the operational entity coordinating the defense, to OMB for issuing the right directives. As the coach, as we've used that term before, I need to ensure that those roles are properly assigned, properly executed, and ultimately to do performance assessments to ensure that we're meeting the need.
And let me ask you this, this organizational chart, again, where we've talked about in the past the overlap, and you just talked about the National Security Council overlap with what you're doing. Do you think the federal government's organizational structure is effective right now, and do you think that the lines of responsibility are clear?
I think it is reasonably effective. Can we make it better? We can, and we will. The three of us at this table talk on a daily basis about how to actually ensure that these roles complement one another. I would observe that the chart, you've been generous, the chart does not show sector risk management agencies. That's a further complication of what they do on the edge of the enterprise that they represent. All of those strengths represent diversity, which properly applied can be a huge strength for us. It is perhaps then less complicated than the U.S. Department of Defense or an American football team, which, if it has the right strategy, if it has the right roles, if the life forces that course across it create coherence, unity of purpose, unity of effort, it can, in fact, be quite useful. That's our job, is to make sure that the video actually makes sense, even if the static picture does not.
Mm-hmm. Well, you make the football analogy. There you have a coach who's ultimately responsible. You have a quarterback responsible for the offense, and the question is, how do you have that with this more diffuse structure? Is there any thought of issuing an executive order or some other rulemaking to more clearly delineate what the lines of responsibility are?
I think that's essential. We're actually taking our time, not because we're complacent in any way, shape, or form, but taking our time to actually let experience, a modest amount of experience, drive our efforts to then clarify in writing what we believe is the right and proper way to describe that chart in action. I think you would have hopefully seen over the last 3 or 4 months There were several times when we reported informally to this committee, not on a major incident, but an incident we thought was reflective of the work that we do together, where we surged to the point of need to assist an agency that was encountering some difficulty. We checked the rest of the enterprise, the federal enterprise in that case, to ensure that that had not been something experienced by others. We visited with the investment strategy using OMB resources to ensure that we were making the proper investments to get ahead of this, and reworked that accordingly, and then ensured that ultimately those best practices became something that everyone could benefit from. That's complicated, that's hard to do, but it is the necessary work of the leadership that you've charged to undertake coherence in that diagram you have behind you.
Well, let's go to one of those points that you just made, which is the cybersecurity budgets for the agencies. Mr. DeRusha is here with us on the panel, and you're here on the panel, yet both of you have that responsibility, as I understand it. You have responsibility over the agency cybersecurity budgets and what they ought to be. Is that true, Mr. DeRusha?
Well, sir, OMB does, absolutely.
So say it again.
I'm sorry, sir. Yes, OMB has a responsibility. It is a shared responsibility between the management side, but largely the budget side, the resource management officers.
Okay, I don't want to put Mr. Inglis on the spot here, but would you agree with that, Mr. Inglis, that you don't have responsibility for cybersecurity budgets?
I don't have unique and solitary authority over that. I agree.
Not unique and solitary, but Mr. DeRusha just said that it's OMB who has unique and solitary over that responsibility. And my understanding is that you believe you have responsibility for it, too.
Oh, no, sir, I don't. By statute, I have the responsibility to report on performance. I don't have the authority to direct dollars. I don't have the authority to move dollars, but I think I have a useful and necessary function to report on performance. I think by example, what we've done has actually joined those two responsibilities in a way that's coherent. Take the Technology Modernization Fund in hand. As earlier described by Mr. DeRusha, there's $1 billion allocated by the Congress for that purpose. There's $2.3 billion in applications. OMB, using its authority, has described what the requirements are that would allow them to judge the merits of any particular application. They've impaneled a board. I have looked at those requirements. I have judged that the panel is an appropriate panel to adjudicate this, and I look at each of the applications and each of the awards to ensure that they're consistent with our overall cyber strategy. I therefore am in a place where I am performing my responsibility to ensure performance, at the same time allowing OMB to perform their statutory responsibility to be accountable for the budget. Those two nicely, but in a complicated way, intersect at this thing we call cyber. I think that's by statute where we are. We could possibly clarify that to a greater degree in the FISMA modernization and other bills, but the things that I think that we're enjoying at the moment, we can achieve coherence with the roles as they are defined.
Okay, well, I'm over time already, and I apologize to my colleagues. Let me just read the statute for what you're supposed to be doing. Reviewing the annual budget proposals for relevant federal agencies and departments and advising the heads of such departments and agencies whether such proposals are consistent with the national cyber policy and strategy. Sounds like you're involved in their budgets, but we look forward to further conversation, second round. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.